Hello everyone, my name is Ian, the part-time Dungeon Master, and as always, I'm your host for D20 Sundays. Welcome back. Before we get into today's episode, links down in the description for the merch store on Zazzle. Please give it a look, see if there's anything you like, and, purchase something. If not, then tell me what you'd like to see. But yeah, on to today's video, which is on Game of Thrones. So, where to start with this? Well, a coworker had come up to me at some point in the past and said, "Hey Ian, you're really big into Dungeons and Dragons. Are you also into Game of Thrones?" And I said, "No, it's not really my cup of tea." There's a few reasons, but for the most part, the discussion went on that they thought I would be really big into Game of Thrones because I like Dungeons and Dragons, and Game of Thrones is just like Dungeons and Dragons, which they're half right and half wrong. And a little bit requires me to explain that there are more than just Dungeons & Dragons when it comes to tabletop RPGs. There's the Star Wars tabletop RPGs, the Star Wars Sagas, the D20 version. There's Dragon Age, which uses D6s. There's Dark Fantasy, which is its own system. There's Thieves' World. There's the Warhammers. There's so many different types of tabletop RPGs that saying they're all Dungeons and Dragons is really misleading for one, and kind of insulting to each individual game, because every single one of them has their own unique thing. And not to mention, yeah, a number of them could definitely bring their inspirations from Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't mean that they are Dungeons and Dragons. Now, here are some things about Dark Fantasy, which is essentially the type of game world that Game of Thrones would be in. It's got low amounts of magic, or almost no magic, except for it's very ritualistic and it requires a lot to do. There's a lot of death, there's a lot of disease, very easily lose hope. There's no divine intervention, really. It's very heavy political-wise. There's war, very easy to lose hope because of war or because of death and disease. And there's not very many other races, as in far as, there's no elves or dwarves in Game of Thrones that I've seen, except for Tyrion Lannister, who's not really from the race of dwarves, he is just a dwarf. So, saying that Game of Thrones is Dungeons and Dragons is half right and half wrong. In order to create a D&D game that is essentially like Game of Thrones, you would have to cut out so much from the D&D books that you might as well just make your own system and call it the Game of Thrones D20. Because there goes, wizards as far as quick casting magic missiles or sleep. They have to do long rituals. Poisons and so on have their own unique rules based on what kind of poison they are. There's no elves, there's no dwarves, there's no orcs, there are undead, but dragons are such a rarity. There's no centaurs. There are so many races that you could be in Dungeons and Dragons that you can't be in Game of Thrones. So, interchanging the two is wrong, for one, because of those very key differences. But also, interchanging them would be difficult in the sense if you wanted to run a Game of Thrones-like game in Dungeons and Dragons. If you wanted it to be specifically to the Game of Thrones world and no variation from it. And honestly, it would just be much better to either make your own system or use one of the other tabletop RPGs, because their system would be much more accountable for it versus Dungeons and Dragons, which, even though there are ways of making it into a low magic or a no magic setting, they are primarily medium to high magic game settings, because that's just kind of how things work, especially when it comes to magic weapons. And whenever you get a D&D group together, it's never going to be all human. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have one person play an orc, you're going to have one person play half elf or an elf, you're going to have one person play a dwarf, you're going to have someone play a Goliath, you're going to have someone play a merfolk or a Ganassi or so on. There are so many different races and possibilities for classes in Dungeons and Dragons and the combinations of the two, that confining it just to humans and a few select classes, such as the ranger, but has no magic, the rogue, the fighter, maybe the cleric could get by, but even then very limited divine magic. The wizard maybe, but his spell style is way different than what it is in the D&D books, because it would be an evocation or conjuration and so on, because it has such a very strict and narrow kind of way that the magic works. Like I said, it'd just be easier to make your own system. It's like this is, Winterfell D20. Something like that. And I think that's part of the reason why I don't like Game of Thrones, aside from the incest. That weirds me out. Aside from that, though, I don't really like Game of Thrones because it's not really my cup of tea, but at the same time, a lot of people, to me, have tried comparing it to Dungeons and Dragons, and it's not interchangeable because of those very large differences in them. You've got one side that's, a very good dark fantasy, but it's very restrictive when it comes to that fantasy word. A lot of people, when they think fantasy, they think fairies, elves, dwarves, very Lord of the Rings kind of mentality. But even then, Game of Thrones isn't very Lord of the Rings. Because Lord of the Rings has, again, elves and dwarves and wizards and dragons and so on. But Game of Thrones has humans and a few dragons that are the first that they've ever been seen. A dwarf or two, but they are not really the race of dwarves. They're essentially, oddities, strange births. There are no elves. Magic itself is different and all that. So comparing and contrasting the two, definitely, but as far as saying they're interchangeable, no. Lord of the Rings is a lot less heavy in the political side of things, too. As Game of Thrones is pretty much all political intrigue. It's like who screwed who, and who married who had a child with who, and so on and so forth. That's another thing. Probably the reason why I don't really enjoy Game of Thrones is that it's way too politically heavy, and it's, way too much drama for me. So I'm just, it's like, That being said, I've definitely played in some very dark fantasy kind of worlds, and I've posted up on Reddit at one point, I said, how evil do you go as a dungeon master? And that's really up to the dungeon master and the players, what kind of world does the dungeon master want to play versus what kind of world do the players want to play in. If they both want that Game of Thrones, very dark, where, a single wound could fester and become infected and cause you immense amount of pain, or even kill you later on if it's not properly taken care of, then yes, that is something that you can definitely play. But restricting Dungeons and Dragons down to where it's only what's in Game of Thrones, you might as well just use a different system, because you're cutting out so much of what is Dungeons and Dragons. Anyways, I guess that's all I wanted to talk about today, and appreciate you stopping by. Laters.